Before we begin, as you can see, this session is being recorded and it's going to be posted to our CTSI YouTube channel at a later date. And as you have questions, you can either type them into the chat or you can just raise your hand and unmute yourself so that it's more of like a conversational flow. And with that being said, today's topic is distinguishing translational science from translational research, presented by Dr. Murphy. Dr. Murphy is a SUNY Distinguished Professor of Medicine and Director of the CTSI here at UB. And as many of you know, Dr. Murphy will soon be retiring from UB, so we are very appreciative of him for taking the time to present to us before he enjoys his well-deserved vacation and retirement. So Dr. Murphy, you can begin when you're ready.
Thank you very much, Marshall, and my apologies. The technical difficulties were on my end. Anyway, it's nice to be here, and thanks everyone for joining. What I'd like to do then is talk about, as Marshall said, and the topic of this is translational science and translational research on these concepts and how they differ. But before I do that, what I want to do first is tell you the bigger picture of why we should care about that and why, translational research and translational science is getting such tremendous national attention and why people would even want to participate in clinical research. And then I'll talk about the differences in these things. And I think the best way to illustrate those is with examples. And it can almost affect your thinking about, translational science and translational research. But let me start simply with definitions. So translation is, if you think about moving scientific discoveries into new treatments and interventions. So it could be laboratory innovations, clinical observations, community-based innovations and that sort of thing, moving them into interventions that improve health. Translational research is a project in that particular step. Might be drug development, might be testing a vaccine, might be testing a behavioral intervention for a particular disorder. And then translational science is actually the field of investigation to understand those principles in the steps in the translational process. Or the other thing to think about it is, and I'm going to show you this incredibly long, inefficient, expensive translational pipeline. How do we reduce that? How do we make that more efficient? And that's what translational science is. So translational research is what many of us are doing and have been doing. It's, trying to develop better healthcare. And then translational science is trying to improve and shorten and make more efficient that pipeline to create and implement new interventions. So let's talk about briefly this translational research spectrum, which you may have heard T1 through T4. So T1 is kind of preclinical studies. Could be animal studies, could be cell-based studies and laboratory-based studies and so forth. And then T2 research is clinical trials. So very well designed and controlled clinical trials, and generally phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials. Early human studies are considered part of T1, the first in human studies. And then so T2 clinical trials, T3 then is bringing clinical trials into the community. Okay, so you can show in a very controlled situation that a new medication works. Well, when you treat the whole population, what about people that might have been excluded from the clinical trial? Does it actually improve health in the community? And then phase 4 trials are trials that are done after a drug has been approved by the FDA. So an FDA might approve a drug with a couple 100,000 participants in clinical trials, and yet, the phase 4 trials may include a couple million. So, if you have an adverse event that occurs every 1 in 200,000 people, and you have studied 150,000 people in the phase 2 the T2 clinical trials, then you would miss potential adverse effects that once you start rolling it out into millions, 330 million people in the U.S., then you're going to see phase 4 clinical trials can potentially identify additional adverse events or other things that happen with the drug. So those are important. And then dissemination, implementation, and health services research is part of T3. And then T4 are population outcomes, kind of thing that the CDC does, for example. I love this example of T4 translation research. So there is a pneumococcal conjugate vaccine that from the year 2000 on, essentially all children who get vaccinated, it's part of the vaccine schedule for children. And that prevents these invasive pneumococcal diseases that occur in children and are associated with a certain number of mortalities and bad illnesses each year. Well, the CDC started studying around 2006, looked at the population of, pneumococcal infections and found that the pneumonia in people over the age of 65, the pneumococcus is also the most common cause of community-acquired pneumonia, which goes way up in people over the age of 65. Pneumococcal pneumonia from 2000 to 2006 went to 50%. It dropped 50%. And yet no one over the age of 65 had received that vaccine. Well, it turns out that the immunizing all the kids reduced the organisms in the throat of kids, so they were no longer giving them to grandparents and older people who they interacted with. So that's a great example of what we can learn from that kind of T4 research. Here's another way to look at this pipeline. So this is sort of an optimistic one. The estimates now are that it takes about 17 years from an initial identification of a compound to one FDA-approved drug is 17 years and about $2 billion. And you can see it's associated with a very high failure rate, 95% failure rate. That's the whole concept of translational science. We want to shrink that 17 years, and we want to reduce that failure rate, and we want to reduce the cost, make it more cost efficient. And that's what translational science is. So what has been done nationally? Well, the NIH created a new center/institute of the 27 institutes that are in the NIH called National Center for Advancing Translational Science. And then part of that, and I'll say that their tagline is now more treatments for all people more quickly. So that was changed about 2 years ago or 3 years ago with a new strategic plan that NCATS developed. It used to be more treatments for more people more quickly. And then, part of this new strategic plan, we've all recognized that not everybody has, if you want to say, the same opportunities to benefit from participating in clinical research. So now NCATS is placing a priority on making sure that populations in clinical research and clinical trials are representative of our population, of our country's population. And then in 2006, NCATS, or the predecessor of NCATS, it was established the Clinical and Translational Science Awards, the CTSA programs. And these are large grants that go to between 60 and 65 institutions nationally, depending on how many are funded at one time. And the whole idea of these CTSA awards, again, is to advance translational science, reduce that pipeline, make that pipeline of developing new healthcare interventions and improving health more efficient, shorter, lower failure rate, less expensive. Here are where the CTSA hubs are in nationally. There we are. Like I say, there are 60 or 65. There are two new ones in the past year, one Dartmouth and one Baylor. So there's a third one there. That's Houston, Galveston, and then Baylor is in Houston. So those are two new CTSA hubs that were funded, I think it was last year, 2024. And then, so one of the things that happens when you have a CTSA grant, like we do, we've been funded by CTSA grants since 2015, is we get the large grant to do the work and hire talented people to help accelerate translational science and translational research, but you also automatically become part of this consortium. And it is a great consortium to be part of because it is a very collaborative and collegial group. We're all looking to collaborate with each other because we can do more and we can learn from each other. We can share our innovations and so forth. So this was actually a figure from our grant that shows the collaborations that we've had. Some of them are really very initial and were just a connection, a limited connection. Some are really excellent and robust collaborations and partnerships. And I'll show you one of them a little bit later on as an example of a great translational science project that we're doing with 3 other hubs. So what do we do locally? Well, in 2012, opened the Clinical and Translational Research Center. So that is the top half of this building I'm showing you. I'm in it right now. And it is a building devoted exclusively to clinical and translational research. It sits above the Gates Vascular Institute, which is a Kaleida-owned and operated building, and the CTRC is a UB-owned and operated building. Great and important partnership. If you're going to do clinical research, you got to have patients, you got to have people, and so an elevator or stairway connects us with the clinical, the largest healthcare, largest hospital system in the area, the Kaleida health system. So this was a huge commitment on the part of UB. And then in 2015, as I mentioned, we were able to join the consortium and have the CTSA grant in order for us to advance clinical and translational science in Buffalo. So I'm coming to that. Nope, I'm going to do that right now. So I'm talking about why we, as investigators, what we're trying to do, and as institutions, we're trying to, get more people into clinical trials, move these innovations along. Well, what are the benefits? Why should people actually want to participate in clinical research? Well, one is access to a treatment that isn't available. A great example are these TAVRs, the transaortic valve replacement for replacing aortic valves. It used to be people had to have open heart surgery to replace aortic valves. Now, many people are able to get these with an incision in the groin, and they replace the valve transaortically. They go up the aorta and replace it that way without having to have the surgery. Well, for a number of years, unless you qualified with very specific criteria, you couldn't have access to that. But if you participated in the clinical trials that were going on, you were able to get that. And you may or may not know that Mick Jagger, the lead singer of the Rolling Stones, had a valve replacement using TAVRs. He participated in a clinical trial. It was not approved when he had his valve replaced. So he was able to get his valve replaced and get back up on stage pretty quickly, as you'll recall, in his 70s, because of participating in a clinical trial. You get regular and careful attention from healthcare professionals. So if you're going and having regular visits and they notice your blood pressure is elevated or they notice a problem, they can help connect you in a lot of ways. Many times you get treatment that's free or low cost. My neighbor here, Dr. Andrew Trelal, is an expert in hepatitis C, did a lot of trials in hepatitis C. And the trials he did when he was, involved in the trials that you went from injectable drugs to pills, were really essentially proven, but they were adjusting doses. Anyone who participated in those trials got free treatment, and that was before insurance was paying for treatments for hepatitis C. You receive expert medical care at leading healthcare facilities during the trial. Most of the time, the people who are the experts in taking in an illness, say atrial fibrillation, they're the ones doing the clinical trials in atrial fibrillation. So you're getting expert medical care from the leaders in the ones doing the clinical trials. You can understand your disorder better, your general health better. You contribute to research that may save lives and improve health in the future, and you're taking a more active role in your research. So these are the reasons why people might the advantages really of people participating in clinical trials. And from a broader perspective, people who participate in research have better health outcomes, have more cost-efficient care, and are more satisfied with their health care compared to people who don't have the opportunity to participate. And probably, we don't have a cause and effect relationship just yet, but probably it's because of all those reasons that I showed you in the previous slide. So I showed you those two linear translational science spectrums. This is a diagram from NCATS, National Center for Advancing Translational Science, where as we've learned more and more about this, it's not a straight line. It's not linear because, if you think about it, so basic research is sometimes called T0. This is the preclinical that I told you about, T1. This is clinical trials, T2. This is moving clinical trials into communities, T3, and this is the T4, the public health. And the preclinical research can inform public health, and they can all interact with one another and vice versa. So it really is more of a circle than a linear pipeline of this translational science spectrum as opposed to a pipeline. So it's good for us to think about these ways, and this actually helps think about the concept of translational science more as well, which again is the study of the process of developing new interventions. So let me give you a few examples, and I think in some ways it's the examples that allow us to let me see if I can move this over. Okay, allow us to allow many people to understand it better. Okay, so a translational research question would be: is a new drug for the treatment of hypertension superior to the standard of care? So a related translational science question is: what are the barriers to recruiting a representative population to clinical trials for the treatment of hypertension, given that participants in clinical trials in the U.S. include fewer than 10% of people who are often excluded from clinical trials? So what you might do is do the trial. The person who's doing this isn't really excited, shall we say, as much about a translational science question as they are. Maybe they've been working on hypertension for 20 years in their career, and they have a drug that they discovered that's better. Well, you do your trial, but then you can compare recruitment strategies, for example, and look at the results of the two recruitment strategies. So not only can you do your trial for the research that you have a passion for, you can actually come up with a generalizable conclusion. That's a big word for translational science. If you can discover something that other people can use in other disorders, that's another kind of characteristic of a translational science question and what translational science is. All right, there we go. Another one. Okay. Is a new drug effective in delaying the onset of dementia in people with Alzheimer's disease? So people with low income are underrepresented in many trials in Alzheimer's disease. So what's a related translational science question? Well, to what extent does so-called discrimination by algorithm contribute to underrepresentation in certain populations? For example, with adverse social determinants of health, like poverty. Well, some of the scheduling algorithms, and this is both in clinical care and in our clinical trial management system, encourage or allow double booking for lower income patients because they're more likely to be no-shows. And, hospitals and doctors' offices lose money when they have no-shows. And so, and this is sort of a side point about AI and these algorithms and awareness of these things. So I think AI has huge potential. And, AI is changing healthcare and changing research, and there are lots and lots of benefits. However, we need to be very vigilant about these built-in biases and built-in inaccuracies and so forth. Unless you take intentional steps to identify them and to change them, AI is going to create a lot of problems for us. And so this is a potential example. So what would be the project? Well, you can analyze the algorithms, go deep, and see what those different clinical trial management systems actually look like, and then you can randomize or look at people who are scheduled using two different algorithms and look at what, for example, the poverty level or the social determinants of health of those two groups are, the demographics, for example. And you can assess the endpoints of recruitment and retention based on those things. So that would be the important generalizable or translational science question related to a project like that, a trial like that. So I'm going to tell you about a couple of our pilot studies. As you know, most people know we have a really excellent CTSI pilot studies program where we award $600,000 per year in pilot studies, with the idea being that you do translational research projects and develop preliminary studies to get the bigger grants. And I'll just say that $200,000 that comes from the CTSA grant, $400,000 comes from our institution, from UB and Roswell Park, and the dean's offices, the vice president for health sciences, the vice president for research. So we have a very supportive institution when it comes to these kinds of pilot studies. And they include that as part of the CTSI, so we manage and decide who gets the pilot studies. So Lise Kaler, who is clinical professor of surgery and runs the kidney transplant program at Erie County Medical Center, was awarded a pilot study in 2021. You could see feasibility study of an e-health educational intervention to increase access to kidney transplantation among African Americans with end-stage kidney disease. African Americans have a high incidence of end-stage kidney disease, and they get fewer kidney transplants than other folks in the population. So Dr. Kaler's approach has been to develop these educational videos, simple videos for your cell phone, about donating kidneys, about learning about kidney transplantation, about how to navigate the system to get a kidney transplant, because it's not easy to get on a list and that sort of thing. And this work led to a publication in the Journal of Transplantation, and it also led to a large R01 grant from NIDDK, increasing live donor kidney transplantation through video-based education and mobile communication. And I can tell you that this work that I'm describing and the work that Dr. Kaler is doing at ECMC also reduced the wait time for kidney transplants for African Americans in Buffalo from 504 days to 302 days. That's a remarkable. So 302 days is better, far better than the national average, and that's what the kind of outcomes that this kind of work can come. So the translational science part of this is okay. This works for kidney transplants. What else can this expertise of developing these approachable, culturally sensitive apps and videos? What else can we do with that in terms of increasing health literacy? I think there's huge potential here in terms of the impact on health literacy and outcomes for other illnesses as well. So you can also, do basic science pilot studies that are translational science. So Dr. Yoon Woo is professor of biomedical engineering. That's a department that spans the Jacobs School of Medicine and Biomedical Sciences and the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. And she was awarded a public study to develop this miniaturized spectrometer as sensing lung cancer markers, almost like they call it a liquid biopsy, and developed a chip for that. And this pilot study provided preliminary data for 2 NIH grants, both the National Cancer Institute for early lung detection, and then the second, one of the 2 grants, she partnered with 2 other folks. Dr. Kate Rittenhouse Olson is actually a breast cancer expert, and so this is a great example. If this works for lung cancer, obviously it can work for other cancers as well. So this is a project that has terrific translational science implications. In other words, it's potentially generalizable. So let me tell you about this clinical trial. So when you're part, I told you that when we become part of the CTSA consortium, lots of good things happen. One is that you have the opportunity to apply for what are called these CCIA grants. Only CTSA institutions can apply for these $5 million grants that are called CCIA as CTSA Collaborative Innovation Awards. And in order to get one of these grants, you need to partner with at least two other hubs. So Dr. Larry Hawk in the College of Arts and Sciences and Dr. Martin Mahoney at Roswell Park, both are national authorities in smoking cessation. They partners with three other hubs actually to apply for a CCIA grant and got it after 2 rounds of application. And essentially, that's the long title. It is comparing remote recruitment to clinical trial compared to in-person recruitment. So we all know what happened in the pandemic. Lots of switching and pivoting to remote recruitment. Well, that has never been studied rigorously. Is it just as good? Is it better, for example, than in-person recruitment? You could see how people who, for example, live on the east side of Buffalo or live in poverty, maybe it would help. So instead of having to come to a medical center or come somewhere, you need transportation, you need childcare and so forth, maybe that would help. On the other hand, look at the digital divide. If you're doing it remotely, you got to have a secure connection to do that. And then maybe trust. You can develop trust more readily in person as opposed to seeing a talking head on a screen. So, we don't know if it's better or not better in terms of engaging more people and enrolling more people. So what they did is the way these things work is your first 2 years, they give you the funding and you gotta meet your outcomes for the first 2 years, and then you get the last 3 years of the grant. And so in the first 2 years, they're doing a clinical trial related to smoking cessation at 2 sites, Buffalo and Penn, and they're enrolling 200 participants. They're in the second year of the study now, and they are ahead, to their credit, of their recruitment goals. And then the whole concept of these CCIAs is that whole generalizability. They don't want to see one disorder at one site. So then these are 2 other disorders. All 3 of these clinical trials include a behavioral intervention and a pharmacologic intervention. And then these 2 trials at Medical University of South Carolina, Jennifer Dane will do that one. We'll look at depression treatment, and then a UAB study will look at opioid use disorder. So the whole idea will be, okay, if it works for smoking cessation in Buffalo and Philadelphia, will it work for these? And it's a very straightforward and design, and basically they're randomizing people to in-person screening versus remote screening, looking at accrual efficiency, and also looking at participant demographics, also looking at secondary outcomes, our study retention, data quality. Are they getting the same quality with remote and in person? And also the efficacy of the intervention. All 3 of these are known to be effective interventions. So we want to make sure that they're still effective, if you will, in both remote and in person, and see if it makes a difference. This is a huge impact, in terms of a rigorous study comparing remote and in-person screening for clinical trials. And this is a sort of a model translational science project. I want to tell you about another one, and this is yep, we got time. A hepatitis C study that was done by Dr. Andrew Talala. In fact, I already mentioned him once in using comparing facilitated telemedicine to treat hepatitis C in people with opioid use disorder compared to standard of care, which is referring to an expert in hepatitis C, a clinician who treats hepatitis C. So it's a multi-site, randomized, so-called pragmatic trial. I'll tell you what that means in a minute. With 12 opioid treatment programs in New York State, and I'll show you where they are in the next slide. It's a so-called stepped wedge design. That means everybody will eventually get telemedicine, but it's done in stages, so you can compare the people who their outcomes when they didn't have facilitated telemedicine compared when they did. The unit of randomization is the opioid treatment center. That's the pragmatic part of it. So it wasn't individuals who were randomized. Some of the treatment centers got facilitated telemedicine, and some were standard of care. The primary outcome measure was undetectable hepatitis C virus RNA at 12 weeks post-treatment cessation. That is the generally accepted definition of cure. Then they also assessed reinfection in 2 years, and they published this study in a high-impact journal, JAMA. These are where the opioid treatment centers are: 2 in Buffalo, 2 in Rochester, 1 in Syracuse, 1 in Westchester County, 6 in New York, 12 of them. And the study design, again, another simple study design. Cluster randomized, as I told you, and then looked at the sustained virological response, and then also looked at treatment initiation and completion rates, satisfaction with healthcare delivery, and then treatment adherence rates. And what they found was really remarkable. One, they enrolled 602 patients. These are people who are often excluded from clinical trials. People with opioid use disorder don't like to participate in clinical trials. They enrolled 602 people in 12 sites, 290 facilitated, about 300 in each one. Look at how many initiated therapy. Look at that cure rate. 90% with facilitated telemedicine compared to 39% with standard of care. High level of patient satisfaction. Treatment adherence once they started was high. Minimal reinfections for the people who were cured, regardless of how they got there, minimal reinfections, and a significant increase in opioid use recovery among people who were cured. And Dr. Talal and his team won one of these top 10 clinical research achievement awards. These are the top 10 best clinical research studies in the country in 2024. And in fact, they choose the 3 top ones, and this one was chosen as one of the top 3 studies. It was supported by a $7 million PCORI grant that lasted. It was a study that lasted 7 years as well. So this is a great translational science project as well. Think about it. Should we be using facilitated telemedicine more for treatment of other diseases, for enrollment in clinical trials for other diseases? One of the things they found is that going to a place that they were comfortable showing up to every day, getting their methadone, was important in terms of, the retention and so forth, and getting people in the trial. And my last slide, I'm going to tell you about one of my favorite pilot studies. I'm telling you about my favorite ones, and there are lots of other favorites as well. This was done by Dr. Lucy Holmes, who's Associate Professor of Pediatrics, and is called Aligning with Schools to Help Manage Asthma Project. That's the acronym. And Dr. Holmes, for 17 years, has been treating kids in a Medicaid clinic for asthma and taking care of kids in the community, mostly kids from families on Medicaid. So she, as part of this, started partnering with school-based health centers. 10 Buffalo public schools have school-based health centers. So this is not just a school nurse, it's a nurse practitioner or a physician assistant, and they actually administer medications and help take care of kids who need it in the schools. And so she found, wow, this might be a good way to do this. So she applied for a pilot study. She partnered with 3 of them and did a study and enrolled something like 20 or 25 people and compared those who were managed in their asthma in the school-based health center in partnership with Dr. Holmes, who was kind of doing the managing and advising the health-based centers, compared to standard of care, which is referral to your primary care physician, and showed, in fact, it wasn't a clinical outcome, but it was a, excuse me, a pulmonary function outcome. And this led to a large R01 grant that was funded in 2023. So it's, and she got all 10 of the, excuse me, all 10 of the health-based centers. All right, I'm good. Participating. So this study, a couple things I really like about this study. This came from Dr. Holmes practicing medicine in the community and identifying an opportunity. And she, from that, came up with the idea for the pilot study. She'd never had a grant before. She put together a great team to get this grant, a large R01 grant, first grant, and now she's in the second or third year of the grant, enrolling kids and doing this study. So it's also easy to see what a great translational science project this is. In fact, I think, we think about how we can really change healthcare. We need to change systems. Maybe what we need to do is reimagine how schools and healthcare for children should interact. And maybe we need to really increase healthcare delivery as part of schools. Kids come to school every day. It's a great way to reduce that barrier. So anyway, this is another, I think, fabulous translational science project that gives you that idea. So those of you who are researchers and you're looking to do translational science, you can still do your translational research. In fact, the CTSA leader, Dr. Mike Carrilla, says you can't do translational science without doing translational research. So you can keep doing your translational research, but you can design within your translational research studies translational science projects in a translational science angle. So I am going to stop here